everybody, how's it going? The Master Sword, one of the most iconic weapons in all of video game history. It's right up there with Final Fantasy VII's Buster Sword and Half-Life's Crowbar. It is the weapon most used by Link to defeat the evil Ganon, and if we can all agree on one thing, everybody wants it. Many have tried to replicate it, a lot have failed. I'm here to tell you that I did an okay job, but in today's video I'm going to show you how I turned this piece of rotted wood into the iconic Master Sword. So there are so many incarnations of the Master Sword, I didn't know which one to pick, so I kind of took the one that I knew best from Legend of Zelda 64, or Ocarina of Time, and a picture I found on Google which I believe is the Breath of the Wild sword, or Skyward. I haven't played those, but the design is pretty cool, so I just took a mixture of the two and put them together. Now before we get started, in the past I've made a lot of different videos of me building things, and they tend to run a long time, so I'm trying something new. I really condensed the footage down to keep it under a half hour. If it's too fast, let me know in the comments down below, that way it lets me know that you guys want a slower pace. But with that out of the way, let's go build us a Master Sword. Alright, first thing on the list, let's talk about the tools I used. An electric saw. This is primarily what I use to cut out the shape of the sword. A Dremel. I use this to smooth the edges and get the fine detail within the sword. A sander and lots of extra sand sheets. This is used to smooth out the blade as much as possible, along with smoothing any of the edges that may come out looking jagged. A mobile saw blade. I use this for any parts that the electric saw couldn't get to, either because the wood was too thick or it was giving me too much trouble. I also used a traditional saw blade, which you'll see why later in the video. Clamps. These are used to keep your wood stationary when you're trying to saw through it. Good old tape. I used a combination of duct tape and painting tape. Wood filler. If at any point in the project you feel like you've made a dent or messed something up and chipped off a piece, you can fill it in with this stuff. As you'll see in the video, I ended up using it a lot. Gorilla Glue. When cutting the whole project apart, I couldn't just make it out of one piece, and this stuff came in really handy. A variation of spray paint, including blue, silver, and yellow. The gray one is primer, which comes in really handy when you're trying to fill out the wood. I ended up going through 2 cans just to smooth it out as much as possible. The see-through cap is clear spray. I used that in order to protect the color of the paint once I'd finished the project. Safety gear. In this project I used gloves, a pair of glasses, and a mask. You don't want anything flying in your eye or breathing in all the sawdust. And of course, a piece of wood. I didn't get the dimensions of the piece of wood. It's probably 5 feet by 1 foot. Again, this was just a rotten piece of wood that my neighbor had. Alright, here we go. Let's get started. The first thing you do is find a good picture of the Master Sword that you want. And then using a ruler and a pencil, measure out the whole thing and place key dots in areas in order to visually assemble your Master Sword. Once you're done designing it, fill it out with a marker or Sharpie. That way your lines are visible. Now as you can see, the Master Sword wasn't going to fit on one piece of wood, but I'll show you how I fix that later. Next up, we're going to start cutting it. Now if there's something I really have to stress here, it's that the clamps have to be on tight and securely to the table. Otherwise you end up like this. Once your clamps are securely tight, go ahead and use the electric saw and trace cut where you had your lines. This is a relatively hard part, so take your time with this and know that everything I have here is sped up footage. Once you have it all cut out, it should look something like this. Using 2 pieces of the sides that were cut off near the blade, I'm going to glue them to the rest of the M where the Master Sword hilt would be. So using tape to hold them in place, put the glue on the sides. This is what it looks like after 4 hours of drying. It may look ugly now, but we're going to sand it down later. Now, go ahead and finish the design of the Master Sword hilt. And go back to cutting. I used one of the tools that I didn't show you in the beginning because I only used it for this one part, and you could probably get away with it using the electrical saw. So, with everything glued together and sawed out, you should have a sword that looks something like this. Now on the hilt itself, the Master Sword M part has some sort of grooves and designs in there. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil those out, followed by the marker. When you get them, go ahead and smooth down the edges using your Dremel. The Dremel comes with a lot of different parts. Go ahead and use whatever you find is the easiest for you. Using one of the saw tools, I cut off part of the hilt, making it look more like an octagon shape. It won't stay that way for long though, because I'm about to sand it down to give it that round shape. Once you're finished with that, you can go ahead and smooth more of the hilt out using your Dremel. You can already see it's coming along nicely, and the smoothness really makes a difference. Go ahead and put as much design into this as you want. Now, using a leftover piece of wood from the initial design, I pick up a scrap piece. Now, I'm going to highly recommend that you do not do what you see here. I actually had a second piece of wood in the back that I could push along. That way my thumb doesn't get cut off when I'm sawing it. Once I sand it down, I have a flat piece of wood that I'm going to use to make the very edge of the hilt. I cut it out as closely as I can, and I begin smoothing out the edges. It's somewhat good, but it's not perfect. Now, using a full piece, I'm going to use for the absolute tip of the hilt. I make another circle around the hilt and get ready to cut it out. This one was a lot more tricky because of the size of it, so I just clamped it down and sawed it bit by bit. After a bit of smoothing, it should come out looking like this. Off screen, I glued it together and used some more wood filler, and when it was dry, I smoothed it out again. Now, the blade isn't supposed to be that thick, so what I did is I measured it out on the saw blade itself, using tape and a piece of wood that I can clamp down, and sawed it sideways in order to get a much thinner version of the blade itself, or rather the blade portion. This part's a bit tricky, and be forewarned that the blade itself will not be smooth, so expect to get your wood filler ready. Because I couldn't get all the way on the blade itself, I had to cut as far as I could and then just cut it out manually. Now it's a lot more like a blade, but you see all those grooves on there? We're going to have to try to sand those out. Using the sander, I try my best to smooth it out as much as possible. It's not perfect, but for whatever I can't reach with the sander, I'll use wood filler and fill it out, and then just try to sand it again. Looks good though. Now there's a little part right at the edge of the hilt and the blade itself. I'm going to try to do a little design there. So I just mark it with a pen and then go over it with a Sharpie. Using one of the various pieces of the Dremel, I cut it out. And bam! It's still in rough shape, but I can get in there with the Dremel now. After a bit of smoothing out the edges, it's starting to look a lot more circular. You may not get it right away, so just keep at it. Now, for all those parts of the blade that I couldn't get in there with the sander, I'm just going to apply a layer of wood filler. As you can see, the cut wasn't perfect, so I had to use a lot of it, which is fine, because once it dries, I can just sand it down. Now the blade itself kind of has these interesting curves on it from where the sharp part ends and then restarts. So I'm just putting down some lines in order to measure it out. Once I have all my lines out, I do a thin layer with the Dremel just to get an idea of where the blade will start its sharpness. Same thing right at the edge of the hilt. If you look at the picture, it's kind of sharp right up there, but that ends at the curve. So using a smaller piece of the Dremel, I go along there and I do my best. Once you're done with the Dremel, go ahead and try to sand it down as best you can. I'm telling you, this sanding machine was so great to have. Definitely better than doing it manually with a piece of sandpaper. So, now that I'm done sharpening the blade, it should come out looking something like this. Again, I reapplied more wood filler just to get it as close to smooth as possible. Now I'm sure most of you noticed that there's a Triforce right along the blade. So using something straight, in this case a metal ruler, I go ahead and try to measure it out as best I can. Trying to get the triangles to all relatively be about the same size. But again, I eyeball most of this stuff, so don't take it from me. There's also an outer layer on the sides of the Triforce. So again, using my ruler and pen, I went along there and just designed it as best I could. When you're ready, grab one of the discs from your Dremel and just ever so slightly cut into it. Trust me, once you put on the silver paint, any imperfections will shine out, so you really don't have to make the cuts too deep. Now going along, I'm doing one layer of primer on one side of the sword. Underneath the neck of the hilt of the sword, there's a piece of wood holding it up so it doesn't touch the mat directly. I'm also using a good sized piece of wood there because with the spray paint coming down on it, it leaves the design, giving me a piece of wood that I can trace out easily in order to complete the neck part of the hilt. With its thickness the way it is, I was able to cut it in half and have two pieces, one for each side. I mark them and then smooth them down. Once they're all smooth, you can go ahead and glue them to the neck of the hilt. I could have just sanded around the hilt itself, but because I did this, it's going to give it more depth. Now, if there were any cracks and crevices, just fill them out with wood filler and sand it down. This was a little too hard for the sander to reach itself, so I just did it by hand. Anything that may be too excessive, I use the Dremel and just smooth it out a bit more. Now those two side pieces I cut off earlier, they aren't necessarily junk. I can use them for any extra design I want to do. In this case, I want to add a little more detail to the hilt. So I cut out two flat pieces and designed a little bridge along with a diamond shape for each side. After measuring it out, I glue it on and it fits perfectly. Again, these are just extra details, but you're definitely going to want something like that. Now that I'm all set, I glue the top on as well, to the absolute edge of the hilt. I'm using my famous dollar store glue here, which sticks very quickly. Once you're done, I used a bit more wood filler and just smoothed it out. As you can see, the blade is really coming along now. I set all the pieces down, including the two diamonds, and I do another layer of gray primer. Wood absorbs a lot of the paint, so I actually did multiple coats for everything. So without any color, this is what the base of the sword looks like. Well, we're almost there. After spraying both sides multiple times, I'm going to start using color spray paint. I take a couple pieces of the painting tape and cut it out accordingly with how the bridge of the hilt would look. Applying a bit of pressure reveals the shape, which made it a lot easier for me to cut out a piece like that. With a little fine tuning, I got it just right. Now to be safe and make sure I didn't get any on the blade itself, I used leftover wrapping paper from Christmas and wrapped it around the entire blade. Now using the blue spray paint, I paint the entire hilt. I used multiple coats and sprayed from all angles just to make sure I didn't miss anywhere. I repeated this process for both sides. Now, remember those two diamond shapes I cut out? I lay them on their own piece of paper with the tape facing upwards and get ready to spray paint it. Same thing for the hilt. There's a little line that goes down, which is also yellow. So I taped it out with a little design so that I just spray that part. Now using the yellow spray paint, I painted everything down, the diamonds and the little hole. Now the paint might not take right away, especially with how cold it is here, so I had to do multiple layers. You know me, usually about 3 coats of spray paint does it. Once they're dry, pick them up. They came out looking pretty good. Now, just like how we did the hilt, I do the reverse, taping up the entire top of the hilt and leaving the blade open for spray painting. I taped everything up and left that little arch available to me, because I want that to be silver as well. I grab my silver spray paint and paint the entire blade. Again, just to be safe, I did it from all 3 angles. Once it dries, and because it's silver spray paint, I'll let it dry a bit longer. I go ahead and take the yellow diamond and press it on to where that yellow line is on the hilt. Glue it on and make sure it's in the right place properly, because this stuff dries pretty fast and you don't want to make any mistakes. There we go, almost done. Last but not least, I spray it with a coat of clear spray paint. This stuff acts as a protective guard, and should anything happen, it shouldn't affect the paint underneath. Now that it's done, let's take a look at how it came out. Alright everybody, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. The Master Sword came out pretty good. I got it as flat as I could. You might not be able to see it, but there's slight imperfections on it. I really like how the Triforce on it came out. That one really came out well. One more thing that I'm sure you noticed in the opening video, because I noticed it after editing it like 5 times, is that the hilt is slightly off center. But that's because I'm an idiot and I eyeball everything. If you do yours, just pay a little more attention to that. And if you make the same mistake I did, you could just shave off a bit more. This is all one solid piece of wood except for these parts, which I had to glue on. But you don't actually have to touch those parts. This is secure with the whole thing here, and it is a piece of wood, so it is pretty durable. Other than that, I'd say it came out pretty good. I'm actually going to hang this on the wall for the next episode, so expect that. If you like this video and you want to see me build another sword that you have a suggestion for, or you have an idea for another video, comment down below and let me know what you would like to see me do next. Otherwise, I will see you on the next one.
貴様の拳などかほどにも効かんわい。お前はもう死んでいる。何？もうは匠で